well, and that's almost it. Just when we do finish today, if anyone wants to join us for a drink, we'll probably be going. Not probably, we'll be going to the New Inn, which is, if you go left out at the front of the university, it's about 200 or 300 yards on the other side of the road. Feels a bit like Homer was there last night with the sort of with the committee. Also, I will say probably a bit more about this in the last session. I'll probably set aside 10-15 minutes at the end of it just to talk about with the next steps. But one of the things that I want to throw into the air is that I'm editing, or series editor of a Bloomsbury series about practice research. One of the formats is to create joint authored books that are discussions like this. So people write a few thousand words, pass it on, respond to the other people's few thousand words, and write the kind of team thing. So it's not an edited collection where everyone's separate, but it's a discussion piece. And it occurred to me that these sessions, or some parts of these sessions, might feed into that as a potential publication. So I'll mention that in a bit more detail. And the idea is also to start the practice research journal from the 21st Century Music Practice. Although I'm already doing the Element series and the Bloomsbury book series, so taking on that as well first. Sorry okay, but that's housekeeping, I think.
Yeah. How long do we have? So should we wrap it up at 11:30 or a little before?
Yeah, just
It's 11.
11. Oh, 11.
Yeah,
9:30, 11, so we've got an hour and a half.
Okay.
Well,
brilliant.
we haven't quite there because I've written it on a bit.
Yes.
but-
Yes. Excellent. We're using a mic.
We're using the mic.
Yeah, we just need to record it.
Oh yes,
Yeah.
I should warn everybody, we are recording. There are mics for people to ask questions and speak as well. Have we got?
We've got a wireless mic on the piano as well for...
Okay, so when we get to
questions.
so when we get to questions and stuff, we can pass wireless mics around.
Let's do it. Hi, my name's Leah. Good morning. First of all, has everybody logged in and watched the 3 presentations for this panel today? Not everyone's nodding, is everyone? Okay, good, because the format today is we're going to sort of refer to those presentations, but we're actually just going to prioritize a discussion and hopefully have cross points across the 3 researchers' work. But we're going to begin with maybe some introductions, and maybe we'll do an introduction and then like a kind of 5-minute overview of your research. And then we'll sort of go around, and shall we do it in the order that it appears on the website, starting with me here over here, and then we'll do B, and then we'll do Adrian?
Okay.
Yes? Okay, so all yours.
So good morning, everyone. My name is Mingyue. It is presented in Chinese manner with the family name in front of the given name. I'm a PhD in music composition at the University of York, specialized in contemporary music writing, and meanwhile moonlighting as a musicologist in Sino-Western music studies. Before playing, are we going to play the presentation this morning? No.
So just a summary of it so everyone remembers.
Okay, so my self-introduction is finished. and actually, I'm not sure if should I just go directly into the overview.
Yes.
Okay. Yes, I'm a little bit confused. So here is some background of the paper. Regarding the existing analysis of the stylistic formation of contemporary Chinese composers, the ingrained boundaries and ideas based on dualism remain tenacious in a way amongst scholars inside China and overseas. As a Chinese composer, I was regularly blamed for lacking Chinese tastes in my music during the years of study in my motherland. especially considering the Chinese state, in a way, increasingly policies its own citizens' expressions of Chineseness. Then, overseas, it often seems that it is the local population who are fixated on Chinese composers needing to sound Chinese, somehow to fulfill the satisfaction of the oral visual transcultural vision of Western audiences. My national identity is hence pushed onto me in the UK in a way a British identity isn't pushed onto a UK classmate of mine. As a result, for years I could not help but wonder whether I was indeed a competent Chinese composer. What exactly is my music when contextualized in social-cultural evolution, which leading to a more substantive yet rhetorical question raised by American Chinese composer Zhou Wenzhong, that is, what then is Chinese music today? This question appears to entail a multi-dimensional answer. From each perspective requires volumes of book to explain, I know. I will apparently not elaborate into details in my presentation in this short amount of time. Rather, to focus on narrations of respective experiences and ideologies shaping individual compositional voices of three active leading Chinese composers. Tan Deng, Chen Qigang, and Wang Xilin, and briefly close from my perspective as an insider. I hope this will condense a potential angle of view for international audiences, scholars, and music critics alike to estimate the stylistic components of today's Chinese works. Thank you.
Thanks for that overview. That was really good. Next, Bea, to introduce your work.
Sure thing. Yeah, the mic is on. Hi, I'm Bea. That's all right. Like, that's how it's kind of spelled. That's all good. I respond to Bea, so we're all good. So yeah, my paper is Songwriting Inside Out, and to give you a bit of background, I'm a singer-songwriter and a practice researcher at Goldsmiths. I have a practice that is quite varied, so I have a lot of background in film, cultural programming, curation, production for events. So like a lot of my research then really looks at interdisciplinarity and what an epistemology of practice might look like. So I really sort of prioritize process in my research and decenter product. So to some extent, there's a sort of positioning against the idea that the recording is defining or like the most defining element of popular music. I think the recording is an artifact. It's an amazing artifact. I love engaging with it. So I'm not sort of like a do not make a product kind of person, but I'm like the making, I think, is so much more interesting and so much more multifaceted. It's really rhizomatic the way that I see it. It pulls a lot of things in, but also works in a lot of different kind of always changing boundaries of limitations, which is really interesting, I think. So a lot of what I do in process films is also looking at like the flawed in songwriting, the really awkward, the mistakes, the things that we don't tend to show. Because I think because of this prioritizing of product, there's a real lack of really looking at what the doing is like and what kind of immense capacity for sort of cross-pollination it has and what the practice actually looks like. I was rereading something this morning again by Ben Spatz, who's a massive sort of grounding figure in how I look at embodiment and practice and understanding what like embodied knowledge might look like. And they were talking about mistakes and errors, and to err not as a mistake, but as a sense of like to drift, to get lost, to go astray. And I think that's a really interesting way of looking at research and looking at practice, looking at creative practice as a sort of continually moving research edge, which I already put in air quotations because, again, that's a Ben Spatz quote, that's not me. But I think pushing against a research edge, a sort of finding the moment of unknown and sort of like a generative discomfort of sort of researching and finding the spots that we normally don't pay attention to, I find is really interesting. Yeah, and I think the other thing to maybe look at, because this practice research is massively grounded in like an autoethnographic account of practice, I think there can be a lot of value in that. It can be a little self-centered. I I see that, but it's also to some extent a sort of I'm stealing, I think, Jess Asodi's phrase here, but it's sort of a burden of truth, which I think is really important in research. That when we talk about something, this is through a sort of like epistemology of how do I know it, because I'm not speaking to how other people know it. It might resonate, it might generate a really interesting discussion, but I'm not sort of going out saying, this is what songwriting is. It's like, this is what it looks like in this specific context for me. And then we see where the reciprocities lie with other practices, with other people, with other communities. And I think that's a really interesting thing also politically. I think there are a lot of violences in a practice, violences of patriarchy, of ideas of mastery, of sexism. There's so much in there, capitalism. I mean, going against product is sort of, it does have some anti-capitalist notions, I'm aware. They're there, and I think they're also valuable no matter what scale they are. And I think there's something really interesting in thinking about, maybe like Audre Lorde's, like the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. So maybe the idea is to kind of, not use the master's tools and really look at process. Thank you.
Great, thank you. All right, and last but not least, Adrian.
Hello, thank you. Welcome. Isn't it cool doing it this way round? I'm really genuinely excited. So just, it might be helpful just to give you a quick top and tail of me, and then that can explain some of the work and what I put in that video that was so weird doing, even though, but we do loads of teaching all the time. I've done loads of video teaching, all of a sudden do a video for kind of peers and stuff, and you go really slow and dramatic.
I was saying that as well.
Yeah, it was kind of fun, wasn't it? So my background, I'm a full-on sort of classically trained a musician. I went to King's and the Royal Academy and did piano and stuff there, and then composition at King's with Harrison Birtwistle, which was cool. And then took a few years out, and then sort of taught and did various things, and then kind of had to really go back and scratch the kind of composition itch thing, and gave up my job. And anyway, went to Cardiff, did a PhD there in composition, and studied writing music, moving notes around and organising sound and all that sort of stuff, and looked at the perception of time in music. Then I was super lucky to get some work, and started working at the Open University and the University of West of England and Cardiff University and all these sort of different universities and stuff, and teaching. And anyway, now I'm a sort of a manager at university. I'm a head of school at Portsmouth University, so run creative technologies, the school there. It's an amazing school. It's full of 70, 80 brilliant, amazing staff. And I find myself right on the fringe of it as a musician. So you have games and digital media and user experience design and interaction design, user experience. But fundamentally, I'm not on the fringe of it, because music is relevant to everything. Sound is relevant to absolutely everything. So what I kind of do in the time that I can scrape now to do what I really love, which is mess around with pitch, timbre and time, and to make it into sound is still composition. So I'm quite lucky, because I've over the years had some sort of chance to write for orchestras. So the theme of this was taking that to a different kind of space, I suppose. So when I was doing a doctorate back in Cardiff, I wrote a couple of pieces for the BBC National Orchestra of Wales, and the first kind of little interludes for the talk were actually the BBC National Orchestra of Wales little bits, and it's kind of cool. And what I found out is it's really impossible to make an orchestra sound crap. It's really, really impossible. Have you? Yeah. Brahms. But no, you whoa, contentious. Let's get a discussion going. But the it's challenging, isn't it, to make an orchestra with some basic skills sound really bad. I think that it's difficult sometimes to get an orchestra to be able to play something because the musicians are human, obviously, and you have all those interesting kind of challenges then around, as a student composer, winning an orchestra across was incredibly challenging. So you really had to know what you were doing, what I was doing back then. So since then, working with musicians, that's one of the key challenges is it's the personal kind of interaction with those musicians. And when I was taught, when I studied with, Harry and all that sort of stuff, it was the same thing, whether he's working with the Ensemble Contemporain or whoever it is, you've got to have that personal relationship to know how far you can push them. And then obviously recently you've got this one specific thing that in my video I was kind of looking at, which is the Spitfire audio samples. So they're kind of set out as being film samples for film composers, so mirroring East-West, but which is over in the States, but they kind of, in the UK, based all that kind of area, but more for film, TV composition, games composition. But I used to be an academic. I used to have a colleague who's now their lead software developer. So I kind of work quite closely with them. And actually what they've realized is they can do so much more than what they're doing just for film composers. So it's actually quite interesting to use those sounds in what I would see as traditional kind of classical composition in a way, but to break the rules a little bit by just pushing what's actually physically possible. So that's the kind of angle for me justifying spending some of my time making organized sound, making some tunes. There's a theme about it, which is viruses. So there's 5 orchestral pieces that I've worked on over the last few years. I like some of them, don't like some of them, doesn't really matter. But I thought it might be interesting because we've got an artifact there. Whoa. So thanks, yeah.
So this panel has sort of been arranged with a really lovely, diverse collection of practices, but I'm sure that there's going to be resonances between your research. There were 2 questions that we wanted to explore, and I've got a couple questions. So the first question, the overall thing that we're discussing is about technology and basically sort of how technology plays in the creative process. And the other question is about the tensions that are behind the creative process that are to do with originality and also external influences. And I want to sort of start with that second question and go to Mihyu with your amazing research into this Chinese sound, which is fascinating and really deep, and also perhaps a little bit tricky to talk about in a colonial country setting sort of thing. You talk about this this quote from Baba about third space hybridity, and that in Hong Kong and places over there, they embrace Western music as part of their tradition, and this kind of absorbing of classical Western, all of these elements, as well as folk music and Eastern classical music into a tradition. I just wondered, has your research shed any further light on this kind of tricky area of Orientalism and exoticism that's associated with Chinese music?
Well, maybe I'm going to extend my research into this area later, but now it is specifically focused on contemporary music writing, especially on my own pieces. And sometimes it can include the indigenous music elements in my hometown, Tianjin, a city just right beside Beijing, but with very, very different people's nature and the linguistic intonations. But to be honest, I'm not a researcher into this colonial kind of studies right now, but maybe someday in the future, I will touch that area.
Yeah, it just seems to be a bit of a hot topic at the moment in the arts. I mean, just going over to Spitfire libraries and things like that. Do you think, one of the, sorry, I'm jumping across. At the end of Mihyu's presentation, there were some questions for the future, and one of them was on the ethics of folding in folk elements. And the question was, what are the ethics there? And I know that Spitfire Audio these days don't really include instruments that are from non-classical, non-Western traditions. How do you feel as a composer of classical music about this idea of Orientalism, and is it a touchy subject for you personally as a creative person?
Oh, that's a big question, isn't it? So I suppose as a creative, it's about about how mindful one is of all the different challenges that we're facing, and actually to ignore something, that's problematic for me. I think to profess to be an expert in a particular area, so the appropriation or misappropriation of different cultural sounds, aesthetics, ideas, and stuff, that would be problematic as well. But to try and be mindful of that and to not kind of, well, what's the medical thing? Do no harm, isn't it? I suppose that's the first thing that we have to try and do, but maybe we need to be more proactive. It's interesting with regard to Spitfire, so I can't talk to their company's kind of aesthetics and all that sort of stuff. I mean, I know that they try and do some things that are a kind of pro-musician, so in a sense they pay royalties when they sell out libraries and that sort of stuff, so that the musicians who recorded the library still get paid every time they send their kind of, because the idea is I'm writing for an orchestra, so I'm not using an orchestra, so there's that kind of counterbalance. In terms of their cultural kind of progression, it's really interesting. I'm going to have to take it away and ask them next week, I think, because I think you've got other, companies like East West, the big American one. They've gone fully global, and you kind of use what they would call world music instruments, inappropriately maybe. But it's very interesting, isn't it, I suppose?
Speaking to a point that Mihu brought up in her overview, that anecdote where you said, as a composition student, you felt an expectation to engage with Chinese-sounding music,
Yes.
whereas a British peer of yours, you felt that they weren't really under the same expectation to make British-sounding music.
Exactly. In both these courses, yes, this is kind of problematic to me, actually. And I remembered when I proposed a project, a compositional project, and one of my professors required me, why not put some Chinese instruments in the project? And I said, why? Why? Can't I just using the Western instrument or orchestras? But why must be Chinese instruments? Because to us, the Chinese feeling is already intrinsically within us, from the blood, flesh and blood, and from immersed from our day-to-day life and experiences, and all this awareness formed from those momentums. So it's already naturally flow through the music. It's not that important whether we include Chinese instruments or not.
Yeah, I mean, this is maybe a personal question. Don't answer it if you don't want to, but did you feel it was racially insensitive for this expectation for you to, because you're Chinese heritage, the expectation is your music will have this Chinese quality and that's what they presume is authentic to your creative voice. Is that an insensitive thing that, you have to deal with? Do you see it as an insensitivity?
Well, I'm already accepted it, and actually it is my nature. It is my identity to be a Chinese-born diasporic composer and located in the UK, and those elements I put all similar composers with similar identity as I do. They include in their compositions, and these are these are already within their identity. So I think that is the authenticity for us as composers.
Nice. I mean, just a quick question to Bea and Adrian. Does your national identity play into the music that you make? Is it something you're conscious of, or is...
Happy to answer that. I mean, it's a kind of answer because my background is I'm half German, half Turkish. I have lived in the UK for about 8-9 years. I've been in Australia for a while as well. When I was younger, the accent is all over the place. How how does identity play into it? I think it does, but in a really weird way, because I think depending on where you are, there's a sense of like assimilation. So when I was younger, I really wanted to not sound different. So that was an interesting one. It was just, oh yeah, people would be like, oh, you don't really have a German accent. And I'd be like, thank you. That's a bit, I mean, to some extent, thank you, maybe. But also, why? And in terms of the music, I think it's really interesting because some of my songwriting currently is predominantly in English, which isn't my first language, but it's so much the language I use that this is sort of what I am used to. But when we talk about language as well and identities, languages have different rhythms and, you know, like, and tonalities. And even if I speak German, like, my voice is different. Everyone who speaks different languages or experiences different languages, and people sees that, it's like, oh, you're like a different person. And I was really curious about this because I did a lot of work with improvising lyrics and songwriting and experiments that I've done. So writing in situ, so not working with poetry or pre-written work and then setting it to music, but doing experiments. And I sit down 30 minutes every day and I write with my instrument and I write in that moment and I don't review until I come back to it the next day. And that had become a sort of muscle memory of one of the ways in which I do things. And I realized this is very grounded in the rhythms, melodies, and musicalities of the English language, which I'm really used to. So, and then I thought about my German language, and I used to write poetry when I was younger. Of course I did. It's always the thing when you go like, okay, of course, a teenager. But my writing in that I actually really enjoyed, and I really treasure the German language. It's a very, very, I think, language-heavy language, and that sounds silly, but like we have very precise, very proud of its language, and has a lot of nuance. So I started writing again in German, but I noticed I couldn't write in situ to melody as much. So the process is different. The rhythms are different. So I started sort of starting from the paper, then bringing it to music. So I think identity is a really interesting one because it's an always sort of shifting thing, right? That's a really long answer, but it plays a part, yes, in so many ways. I'm still finding out.
Yeah, no, and I think just picking up on an offhand comment you said before about sort of, you alluded to the indulgent nature of autoethnographic research and practice research and how it's all this navel gazing and you can kind of get wrapped up in these like, well, who am I? What do I want to say? And what's authentic and what's real and what's true? But actually, these discussions are really useful because it's actually politics, isn't it?
Yeah,
and
it's
actually
massively politics.
Yeah, it is. I mean, sorry, you had something to say on this point before we move on.
Well, I don't know though. I'm a middle-aged, middle-class white guy, aren't I? So that's problematic, isn't it? But what's more? I
don't think that's problematic in and of itself.
It's problematic in this situation for me then because it's clearly wrong for someone to say you should put a Chinese instrument. I mean, we got to call that. You've got to call that out and say that is absolutely wrong. Where it then becomes interesting, this kind of discussion for me, is in the sort of creation of the artifact, in the creation of music, as in through being a composer. So for me, that's all around observing and being mindful of the constraints that arise in the moment, in the act, in the process of making every and each piece of music. So for me, I'm mindful of the fact that I'm a middle-aged, middle-ish class, come from Plymouth, so, middle-class white guy. And I have certain kind of things that have happened to me that I've taken part in as I grew up. So I have certain experiences. Now that all feeds into my constraints around the practice that I will then undertake to make any bit of music. But also, and much more importantly, as soon as I commence working on a piece, on something, on some sound, on some pitch, timbre and time, the material then starts to define and take a life of its own and helps to define the constraints. So it might be that it's for violin, or it might be that it's for an instrument that's got from China originally. It might be an instrument from it might be something else. But the point is, it moves on then, doesn't it? So I think the kind of box of constraints that we use as composers and creatives, it's another thing that informs that. So it's not problematic for me, but it's something to be mindful of, I suppose.
Yeah, I suppose just sort of reflecting on this idea, I think maybe 20 or 30 years ago, it wasn't such a problem for David Byrne and Brian Eno to make My Life in the Bush of Ghosts, and and these days people are looking back at that and going, well, that's appropriating. And I think that maybe our consciousness and our awareness and our sensitivities as creators is evolving on from this kind of let's just grab at anything postmodern, kind of thing. And I think technology might have fed into that. Sometimes you open up technology, particularly, I know I'm probably showing my age here, but I remember a time when GarageBand arrived with all the loops and everyone's like, I'm making music, I'm making rap, I'm making country and Western music. And I think that kind of omnivorous stylistic permission that technology gives you, because it has so much affordance, can often breed this kind of permission in yourself to just do anything and everything. And I think maybe the conversation is turning around more to not just, is it ethical? That's a really important thing, but is it authentic? Maybe
Yes.
as a more self-reflective thing to
Yes.
talk about.
Yes, is this expression I use make me comfortable? Yes, that's authenticity to me.
Yes. Okay. Lovely. I want to talk a little bit about process, B, and your
Hello.
and your lovely, beautiful obsession with it, which I really like. And I'm into process as well. And I just thought it struck me as being interesting that we have sort of classical style composers and a singer-songwriter. And for classical style composers who are writing scores for performances, that to me feels like a kind of finish line that everyone's aiming for. And once the piece is encoded, or I suppose your digital orchestra does change this up a little bit, and we'll get to that. But once you have this piece of music, you have a document, that's the aim. You need to have it finished to give to people to play. But a singer-songwriter working in the way that you work, when you remove the finish line and totally platform the process and make the process the document, I find it really interesting. And I was wondering, is this coming from a place of curiosity and experimentation with process to see what happens? Or is there more of an anti-capitalist thing about it, where you just sort of are denying the product side because you don't want to engage with that aspect of what is a big part of the culture?
Yes and yes. It's a tricky one. I think, there's a sort of I think the difference that you were sort of drawing out earlier, which I think is really interesting, is sort of finish line. The way that I sort of do process means that it has a different sense of directionality. So it isn't necessarily a sort of progressive. It's kind of, going everywhere. It's a little mushroom rhizome thing. So thinking about, I think curiosity versus anti-capitalist notions. I think a chicken and egg. I don't know what was there first. I think the beginning was probably more self-centered when I started, to be perfectly honest. I think I alluded to it in the presentation, but I really had to confront my own practice during COVID. So I did my second master's at Goldsmiths, and I also studied with Mira, who's right there, who really helped shape this. To kind of think about, can I be a songwriter without the studio? Can I be a songwriter without my instruments? Can I be a songwriter when my voice feels really tired and stressed and isolated? I felt a real distance because I wasn't able to produce the thing I was sort of trying to do. And then by focusing on process, I really regained a sense of closeness to my practice. No, this is what I'm doing. This is what it is. And it is so many things. And I don't really necessarily have an outcome all the time. Or it has different directionalities and reciprocities. And I think iterations is one of the words I'm really loving at the moment. So a lot of my songs, my projects, and song can mean a lot of things to me. It has different iterations. I think the recording is an iteration, a moment, a record. The anti-capitalist thing there is really, I think, a sense of anger, maybe, towards, I think, a lot of the violences that people feel when they feel like not good enough in a space and not valid in a space. And that is something I have experienced and something that is really important in my sort of, I've started my teaching practice a little while back. And one of the things I really like to pull out is that when students come to me, and a lot of them have really varied practices, they're not necessarily songwriters, is you already know a lot more than you think. You have an embodied practice. You know things. And that is valid. And I think scale is a whole different sense of judgment. But I think when we think about judgment just as curiosity and think about valuing process, I think that's really interesting, and it's incredibly generative, and it also opens up these directionalities. And, not everyone learns how to do, like, a recording. Not everyone knows how to mix and master. Not everyone has the means to it. Not everyone wants to, is interested in it. And I think, there's a huge disparity in terms of abilities and gender. I think often it's boys that are much more pushed towards or encouraged within technology realms. And these, there's a lot of things then, like the violences I sort of talk about that sort of prioritize a certain sense of output, a certain sense of aesthetic as well. So I think that is my sort of anti-capitalist notion there, where I'm like, these practices are, in my understanding, at heart really experimental and really curious, really generative. At whatever scale they happen, and that has value. And that is sort of my political stance to it. So I think yes and yes, come back to it.
No, I like that a lot. And actually, I think a question for maybe 10 minutes' time is about how technology is at the center of that, opening up the space, because there's so much to talk about women and music technology and having power and control to actually create. That's a whole thing. But I want to go over to Adrian and just talk about, because I felt in your presentation you had a little bit of this when you were talking about this liminal space that opens up in practice, where there's a blurring of a boundary that you felt in your creative practice. And I love it if you could just sort of pick up on those ideas as well.
Yeah, cool. I'll try, but chip in and do ask questions as well. I mean, so I'm really influenced, obviously, by who taught me. So, because Birtwistle, his fundamental starting point was he doesn't care what the audience thinks. Literally doesn't care. Didn't care and couldn't know. And I thought, oh my god! So as a student, that's outrageous. Oh my god! Wow, how exciting! And really selfishly, I'm absolutely still there. So with colleagues now who, Portsmouth's one of the first places to run a games course. It's great. So they run games, it's really good. They work with all the big studios. It's all about making an artifact that then is a game. Not always that's sold, but always involves other people. It's always for other people, for other people, for other people. I don't care. I don't really care what other people think. I mean, I do care, but that's far from the point, isn't it? It's really quite awfully selfish. Or maybe it's not awful. And I think that's where watching and thinking and reflecting on the talks around the practice, that's why it's so exciting. I don't care about the final artifact. That's not the point. I'm not fussed about disseminating it. I'm not fussed about anyone valuing it or judging it or licensing it or any of that sort of stuff. But that comes from a position of privilege because I've got a day job, haven't I? So I don't need to worry about people liking it and selling it. So that's complex as well. And obviously, I'd love it if my wife likes it, or I'd love it if my children go, oh, that's nice. Or even one of my colleagues or some of my peers say, oh, that was really interesting, actually. It was thought-provoking. The one thing I don't want anyone to say is, oh, that was nice. Yeah. That's the only thing I don't want. That's the worst thing. It's the kind of the lack of engagement, the sort of, the elevator thing that's the only thing that I don't want. But I think what's really just going back to practice and how it's sort of how I ended up. Maybe it's interesting. It was interesting for me. So sorry. just at the start of lockdown, I was writing a piece for a community choir down in Plymouth to open the Box, which is their kind of new art centre down in Plymouth. Community choir and basically digital orchestra in the background. So it was the first time I'd done anything like this before. I was like, let's do it. You've got a community choir. Normally you have, someone on the piano hammering away, like, and they all sing. I was like, well, actually, let's see if we can do something that's massive, using a full surround setup of technology and give the choir this experience. So we did a sort of testing down in the aquarium in Plymouth, where they stood in front of the shark tank and sang sort of 5 minutes of music, and we had some stuff coming through speakers. I loved it. This community choir from a really, really sort of socioeconomically sort of challenged area of Plymouth. And it was great. So it was all good. And then obviously coronavirus, it's not happening. It's not happening. It's absolutely gutting. But what was interesting is we carried on for the first sort of few months, because do you remember we were all sort of like don't go out for a few weeks. They're like, no, it's fine. We're going to open the art centre in June. It'll be fine. No, I won't. But anyway, at the time we carried on. But what was really interesting then is, because we had more time, I delivered the piece and been to rehearsals and worked with the choir and worked out what they could sing, what they couldn't, all that normal stuff that you would do with musicians. And then because we had longer, the musical director was kind of, it's like, you know that the sea shanty one you've done? I've sort of done a different melody line. Oh my God! Oh, you changed my music! Oh my God, what have you done? And actually, it was really cool. So we had this and that's that thing of what is a composer and all this sort of stuff. So anyway, it ended up with there's a finished thing, it's sung and it's all good, but that process is just the point, isn't it? It's fascinating, and that's the challenge. And I do sort of care what you think really about my music. I'm just not concerned with it, I suppose. That's the way of clarifying it. Oh man. Yeah, we'll see.
All right, this is like a minor point. It's something that I picked up in Bayer's presentation, where you sort of mentioned that COVID was like this moment where your normal practice, which was quite established, was somehow sort of deconstructed by the situation, and that led to these insights with process. And you just mentioned COVID. I don't know, are we allowed to talk about COVID being a kind of weird time that made our creativity a little bit different? I mean, Mihu, did you have any impact? Was there any impact on your creative process with the COVID lockdown?
Yes, certainly, but it also opened a door for me to realize different approaches. For example, I come to contact with improvisations from folk artists through text exchanges online during the quarantines, and that's also a fascinating process for me. And I mean, a lot of my compositions and lots of the highlights moments of my compositions is actually happen in the process. And especially when including the collaborations with folk artists, because each folk artist, their expression can be individual. And every time is different, because actually when working with them, I don't usually read precisely scores, because they are not going to follow. So a lot of the time I spend is during the text exchange and the video or audio recordings sent over and just going back and forth. So for me, it's the COVID, the quarantine is actually another chance for me to get access to other approaches.
It's really interesting about how disruption can like change the way that we work in really quite productive ways. I want to switch the discussion over to technology because I feel like it's so central to what we do, and often we don't really get to talk about it in a critical and reflective way. And I want to begin with you, Bayer, just about this idea that the practice itself is the work, this kind of, these words that you were using, multimodal, multi-directional, non-linear, rhizomatic, this kind of thing that's growing, that's fascinating to observe. And I just wanted to sort of get a sense from you, like, what is the role of technology in all of that? You're recording, you're producing, you're documenting, you're videoing. Can you
Yeah.
sort of let us know what the setup is and how central it is to your creativity?
Yeah, sure. I think documentation is a huge part of currently my work and especially my research. So documentation, for me, what is important is that it's easy, because I think otherwise it becomes like its own thing. It can become sort of heavy. And I mean that in a way, in some of my sort of self-experiments and things that I've done, it was important for me that, for example, I didn't have a really fancy setup that would take forever to do. Then all of a sudden that was becoming more the work, the anxiety, the I don't know. And then, you know, the actual musicking wasn't that. But obviously technology still like plays a huge part, and there is a sense of performativity still in filming yourself. It changes shape and size, interestingly, like when you get used to it, and you also figure out you can just put a camcorder. I recently bought a camcorder that I think when I turned it on for the first time and you put the date in, it thought it was 2014. And I was like, that's fabulous, because it's really easy and it's just, you know, a bit of technology. You put it down and you record it, and that's great. And that's sort of what I'm aiming for. I'm also really interested in noise and just environmental noise and just like life seeping in, the reality of it. I've recorded a lot of stuff on, Photo Booth on my Mac. It's, terrible quality, objectively terrible, but the file size is small. If I record it on an iPhone, it's huge. It takes a lot of CPU power if I then later want to edit it. These are like real considerations you kind of figure out as you do it. And when it comes to recording, I don't have a studio, and whenever I record stuff that is like an artifact, a song that gets released, I do that with friends of mine who are magicians. They're amazing. And I'm really interested in that collaboration, but that's a real collaborative thing. I can't do that myself. I've taken mixing and mastering courses, and on a theoretical basis, I'm like, I know what you're doing. Can I do the whole thing? No, I can't. And that's okay. I think there's also this idea to be like a sort of one man, one woman, one person wonder of I do it all. And it's like, why? Like, collaboration is amazing. Why would I want to do everything? Because I don't have a studio, and my current flat, it's an old period build. It has big windows, which is lovely, but you know, they rattle. I can hear the communications, the conversations on the road. So when I record sort of sometimes documentations of where a song is, I'll do a condenser mic and have the room in it, because that's my reality, and I find that quite interesting. So I think the technology of what I'm doing is just, I want to engage with it, but I also want it to be somewhat truthful somewhat, because, you know, it's always a mediation of technology, and there's always a sense of, even if I just do it on my laptop or on some stuff and there's no big setup, or I've done whole things where it's just like I think I was in Germany with my parents like a few years back, for family reasons, and I did sort of like middle of the night sessions in their fitness room, which is a glorified thing with like 80s fitness equipment in it. Lighting is terrible. Like, I wouldn't tidy it up because that's where I was, and that's fine, but did I check my hair before I started? Yes. So these are things like performativities that do show up. You kind of get used to recording yourself, and it really sucks in the beginning, because you're like, oh my God, that angle is just not good. Vanity comes in. It does come in, and you go like, oh, and like I'm trying to find a melody, and that's really off pitch. But that's the reality, right? But you know, it's always mediated in some sense of awareness of I am filming. So it's it's an interesting one.
Wow, spoken like a true auto-ethnographer. So we've got this idea of like an audience being there nominally. I mean, I saw this wonderful footage on your presentation of you performing to and in front of yourself, to and in front of
people.
And it really got me thinking about like the role of the audience in your practice. Because so much of your practice is taking the product away, which is the thing that you give the audience, right? And so you're basically inviting them in as participants to your process.
Yes, that's the idea.
How much sort of are you doing this for yourself, and you're doing this for curiosity, but are you also doing it for an online community of people that are interested in your work, or a
I mean,
real life audience, people that are in
We're,
London?
we're working towards it. So I think I'll be performing at the Music We'd Like to Hear concert in July. And that will be a little bit about the awkwardness of performing in a space that isn't, like not actually being in the concert, but in the bit before. Writing in places and showing process and showing that it's weird that you sometimes stare around for a bit and then you go like, And that's, hesitation and silences are really interesting. In terms of community, I think I'm starting to maybe build one. I think it's interesting also when I teach to show it. I find it really interesting to show it to students because for some reason it gives them permission. Yeah. I find to be more honest about what they do, and because it's not perfect and I haven't done it in a way that is really polished and really impressive, it's kind of quite accessible, I hope. It seems to, I don't know, I've experienced like a lot of people when I've had interactions with them in a sort of pedagogy sense, that is a moment where people light up and they're like, oh, I can talk to you. It's not that intimidating. And I'm like, thanks. Because to some extent it's like, oh, it's not that impressive. But I think, yeah, and in terms of audience, it's a really interesting tension because I think the footage that you're referring, that is the first time I'd done that. And what was important to me was that I didn't rehearse it. So I just like set up the space, I think the day before just to make sure it worked. But then I was like, I'm not going to actually try and respond to my own singing here. And so then you have a sort of embodied like, oh, I know in that moment I can do that harmony. And I was like, no. I have the videos, I'm going to play them and I'm going to try and respond to them and continue writing the songs in situ. So I'd never done that in front of people, and weirdly it was really fun. It was really fun. I was really nervous and I was like, this is kind of performance art, which I haven't done before. It's really interesting because there is an interaction, but it comes and goes, right? Like it's sort of, you have moments of like, oh, you disappear into it, but you're aware. It is different, but also the role of the audience is different because I think often they don't quite know what it is either. But other friends of mine who are there, who are also songwriters, then came out of it and being like, oh, like I really like that bit. And for some reason, like a melody thing would then work itself into their work because it was repeated and repeated and repeated. So like the delivery is different as well. I don't know if I answered that.
It's just insightful hearing you reflect on it. And I think inviting people into the process, I think it can engender a playfulness, which is
I think
actually really nice and a bit of a tonic in the current environment of, hyper pristine pop aesthetics where everything's perfect and tuned and tight and quantized.
That's sort of what I was going for.
And if you sort of create space for mistakes, repetition, for change, for growth, it just, I think it just changes the mode of engagement that the audience has, and it makes it more playful and more real, which I
also
really
to laugh. There's moments that's really, I think the family dog was in the video in the beginning, and there's me just booping his nose. And that like actually garnered a reaction in the audience, and that completely changed the sort of atmosphere for a second, which was quite nice. It's okay to chuckle. Like I laugh at myself all the time. Yeah. I think it's important to not be so serious.
I think as well, the presence of mistakes and imperfections sometimes is expressive in its own right and revealing of a truth that I think is interesting. I heard Jan Jelinek's album where he took radio interviews from famous people. There's one by Lady Gaga, took out all the words and kept all the spaces of breaths and hesitances. And it's an amazing insight into somebody who's saying nothing. I just wanted to talk, Adrian, about your use of technology in two ways that I find really interesting. The first way was that, you're coming from you studied with Harrison, you're coming from a tradition that's very specific and really cool. But you're obviously working with technology that's a fast-moving, fluid, evolving thing. And I wanted to ask you sort of about, this adaptability of your compositional practice. I can't, sometimes when we listen to music that's contemporary classical, we imagine that the creator is sitting there with a quill and, with a candle, and they're like just writing it down on the page. But of course, it's mediated by technology, and you highlight the value of constraints. And so I just wanted to sort of ask you to reflect on how do you negotiate these constraints in a universe of affordances, and particularly using software like Spitfire, which is amazing and actually quite poppy and cinematic and, you know.
Yeah, thanks. So I think the playfulness thing is really important, because I think, yeah, it's great to be really serious, isn't it? But I'm with you, Bea. It's playfulness. That's where you get exciting. That's where you get sort of interesting things, actually. And that kind of playfulness between a real live musician and the digital musician is just interesting, isn't it? So having, recorded a live violinist or cellist, I work with the cellist, and then having that recording played back while they're playing other stuff, that's kind of how I started getting interested into this. And then I think that the idea with technology, and that sort of, I used to teach a course called Music for Engineers at the University of West of England, which was basically they're kind of coming in to do either engineering, and it was a module that is like, yeah, go on, just get the engineering students in and give them a bit of culture, and also the sort of music technology students who were the full-on engineers. They were going to do the and they'd not experienced any kind of anything. The first week we used to get them to do a timeline of music, and it would go back at least 3 or 4 years. And that was, and then what we'd gradually do is expand that to 300, 400, 3,000, 4,000, 5,000, and then that was kind of fun, wasn't it? So, but what I learned from that is that technology has always been really, really important in music, hasn't it? Because technology drives, composers and sound artists and creators to you get different possibilities. So technology is obviously interlinked, whether it's the instrumental kind of advances or the kind of places, there's opera houses or whatever, or now online, it's all these it's all interlinked, isn't it, to drive forward music, but also the process, and that's what's really interesting now. So the fundamental challenge for me as a composer, and this is a constraint, an orchestra is what, 35,000 quid an hour, roughly, I think, to kind of, use if you're going to hire. Yeah, sort of standard. I think that's a rough sort of ballpark figure by the time you've got, and then you've also got your minimum sort of 3-hour slot or whatever. So it's out of reach, isn't it? That's not something. The fanciest kind of software library now, you can get East-West ones, you can subscribe, and you can get a close second. So I think there's always been that challenge of how do I get what I want, what I hear. I know what I've got in my head, but how do I kind of get that out? How do I get that outside of my head? Because I can hear it, lovely, it's great. Maybe I should just stop and just keep on hearing it. But how do I get it out? So that's one part of the sort of liminality for me, isn't it? Is getting it from your inner ear out onto, traditionally, a score. It's like, oh, well, that's a really great challenge. Because then there's another process of giving it to an orchestra or a musician or a singer-songwriter or whatever. So whilst I'm kind of classically trained, I don't believe in the kind of genre thing and kind of, it's just pitch, timbre, time. It doesn't matter how someone else categorises it to me. It's just pitch, timbre and time. But how do we get what we hear into a different part of the process? And then how do we get in the olden days, the score to the performer, and then how does the performer get that to the listener? That's what's really interesting, isn't it? And subverting that process and reflecting on it and mirroring it, again, is just exciting, and that's the business of a creative who's involved in composition or, any form of composition, in my mind. I might be really overly simplistic about it, but the final part of the sort of the thing, the amazing questions. The final part, though, was about the sort of tech constraints. So I think with taking the specific example of BBC Symphony Orchestra Professional, what that means is we can move beyond the physical constraints of a musician. So everything that I've written over the last year or two is specifically just slightly beyond what a human can do. So it's really kind of simple idea, isn't it? But the point is, it's just slightly beyond what a human can do, not way beyond. So I had a really simple example that I thought was just really obvious, but kind of simple, is just a French horn, because I play the French horn, or I used to play the French horn, and it's just slightly too long. Now you could get around that, because two horns can blend and you can just have a sort of permanent note going, one can fade in, another one. But actually, it's 8 horns playing this note. Now then, that's not really possible because you can't have 8 horns blending into 8 horns because the manager of the orchestra is going, I'm not getting 16 horns, mate. you can rewrite that because, yeah, we're on 30 grand an hour anyway, so we're not, forget it, mate, forget it. But you can do that in the digital orchestra. You can kind of blend it. Now, the art then, for me, is actually just elongating it ever so slightly. So there's things in the violins, for example. It doesn't really matter what position you're on when you're using a digital orchestra. But if you're writing for a real musician, you've got to bear in mind what position they're on the string and how quickly they can do it. So there's all these constraints that are there with a physical musician that aren't. Now, to totally disregard that and just write whatever you want, that's what happens with a lot of film music and TV music and all that sort of stuff. And it's fine, it generally sounds okay. But actually, isn't there an art in really kind of just augmenting it slightly, imagining that changing positions isn't an issue, using only the G string, for example, right up slightly beyond where it's actually possible to play, all that sort of stuff. And that's what I'm kind of concerned with. So the constraints are totally self-imposed, but that's where they are, just slightly extra human. And it reflects, I think, what you're doing in your practice as well, which is just playing with that reality and that sense of kind of what is real and what isn't. Maybe it's interesting, maybe it's
Can I
not.
ask a question? How do you understand the score in your practice? I'm really curious about that because is the score sort of a sense of a reproduction, a realization of what you're hearing? Is it a tool? What kind of agency has it? Because normally, if a human is playing what you're writing, there's a real interaction and sense of agencies coming together in the performance. So I'm really curious about when you're working with different libraries, technologies, software. What is the sort of like, if you were to draw a diagram of like agencies, how is this interacting? I'm really curious about that.
Yes, so the last couple of pieces I haven't got a score for. So I've done all the pre-composition, uses scores because it uses pitch and arrays and sort of hex chordal rotation stuff and all kind of pitch class sets and all that sort of stuff as a starting point.
Yeah.
But then becomes gestural when you're in the moment of creating with the computer, with the sound libraries and all that sort of stuff. But that's something I'm playing with at the minute. So what happens when we've got the sound and then we want to bring a live musician back into the fold?
Yeah.
So how do we kind of use the score? Traditionally, that's all score-based. So
Yeah.
everything was written for score. So in this suite of pieces, I think what's interesting at the minute, when I put them out on Apple Music and then people kind of comment and stuff, and what's really interesting is some of them were written for orchestra, so are physically totally, playable. And all that's part of what the experience was taking a bit of a beating as a PhD student from an orchestra, saying, this is ridiculous, you can't play this, you idiot. But great experience. Through to now, it's like, I don't need to worry about whether you can play it or not. So that I've got pieces that are written that are perfectly scored in my head, but that are never performed, as I heard them. And that was, that's fine though, because that's what you do when you write a score. You give it away to
Does
a
the
musician.
software have like peculiarities and agencies that you're responding to? Yeah, so like it has.
Yeah.
That's really curious. I think that's so interesting.
But that's it's just supplanting, instead of having to use a score, what we've got in our heads, getting that sound out. It used to be through a score to a musician, possibly via a conductor in some situations, and then to a recording artist, didn't it? Or now it's just supplanting the score, perhaps, to an extent with different software.
Yeah, I mean, it's on the tip of my tongue. We don't call them demos anymore, do we? Digital orchestra. Like this idea of orchestral music can exist separate from the orchestra, and this idea of exploring the uncanny valley aspect. It's like if you go too far, if you go full Vangelis, right? It's like, well, it doesn't sound realistic. It's not meant to. So you read it on an electronic music level, or you read it on a production level. But if you're playing with the uncanny valley of like playability, it's like, whoa, that sounds a bit interesting, a bit weird. And I was like, I can totally like get the fascination with doing that. What I think we should do, I want to ask Mihu about technology in her practice. And then if you've got any other questions for each other, then you can just go ahead and do that. And also we want to make some space for people in the audience to ask questions as well. So we'll do it in that order and I'll stop talking. But if you just wanted to summarize your use of technology in your practice, because I don't want to leave you out of this discussion.
Okay, so basically I'm not a technological person, but during my writing process and rehearsals with the folk instrument, which is very, very hard to combine with Western instrument. For example, the three-string plucked lute, 三弦, and it has a prominent, loud sound. So during my writing for it with violin, and when it gets to rehearsals, we can hardly hear the violin. So violin in front of the 三弦is so loud, so prominent, so it becomes subtle. And so for us to address this problem is to change the position of the microphone. And that helps. So in terms of this combination between these folk instruments and the Western instruments, and so in addition to adjust this difficult combination of the timbres, so there's another sound balance which requires technological solutions for me. Yes.
Like, the literacy of composition now is folding in technology and sound
Yes.
engineering and all of
Yes.
this other knowledge that perhaps wasn't once upon a time part of the program.
Yes.
Do you
Yes,
guys have
that's
questions
true.
for each other before we open it up?
And actually, I have a question for Angian. Angian, sorry. So, do you have solo sound for the artificial orchestra? And I'm really curious that will two violins in this library sound the same or differently?
Oh yeah, so there's an element of randomness in the libraries, so but also you would intentionally kind of randomize things so they don't. There's this awful function called humanize, just a MIDI function, isn't it? And it actually changes things massively. I'm not interested in replicating a single musician because actually having a single musician is something I'd want to do. So what I'm working on at the minute is full orchestra. It's kind of like what in the old days you call a cello concerto, I suppose. It's not a cello concerto. It's a dialogue between cello and speakers, and you need really good speakers, obviously, because that's kind of expensive. But is this how recorded is this? Well, I'm head of school at Creative Tech, so we've bought some really good speakers recently. Imagine that. Yeah. So, but that So the solo thing I think is where actually it's not difficult to write music that makes a solo musician sound bad. It's not difficult. You can write music for trumpet that's too high and the trumpeter gets fatigued and cracks notes. It's pretty. Whereas going back to the orchestral thing, I think it's harder to do that. So my experience is, writing a string quartet or writing something for a band, it's actually very easy to get it wrong. With the more instrumentalists, it's harder. So I'm actually really interested in keeping live musicians in the fold, so especially when it comes to soloists. There's also a pragmatic thing, isn't it? It's more affordable, so we can do that. Yeah, it's more realistic. It's likely to happen, and then we're going to get that experience of working with a live musician with something that's digitally mediated and not fixed anymore, because we can live mirror the time and the tempo and all that sort of stuff. Yeah, it's really interesting.
Yeah, I might have a question for you. I thought your sort of take on, identity and authenticity within composition is so interesting to me. And you obviously also have a cultural experience that is unique to yourself and also shared amongst your communities. I was just wondering, when you're talking about sort of, national identities, in what way also your gender identity might play into composition, or how that even might interact with some of your political statements you've made towards the Chinese state, and maybe what the landscape of composers might look like.
Well, gender identity is not out of my research scope right now, but the national identity, to me, I would rather see myself as individual, and in the individual, me as a Chinese-born composer, and came to the Western land, far away from my hometown, at an age of close to 30. So it's like a transplanted Chinese tree. And in my composition process, I never urged myself to do or to not to do something. And whether it is linked with cultures or integrate with some very close to perfect forms or techniques, it's all these integrated in my music are follow the principle that support my aim to realize the courageous humanistic expression. Yes, and that's what makes me feel comfortable.
Thank you.
An observation really as well, that I just thought it's really interesting watching both of the presentations that you've got such clear identities. And I think as a composer, you always want to try, or as a, however we call it, as a singer-songwriter, composer, whatever, but as musicians who create sound and work in that kind of realm, it's so interesting that you've got so much to say, because that's the key thing. And I think whether how much at the forefront you want to place it will vary from kind of moment to moment in time over kind of careers and lifetimes, won't it? But there's so much to say and it's so well articulated. That's why I'm really nervous coming this morning, because I feel like I'm just playing around with, like, is it tech or is it live? I don't know really. It's like, I do care. Did write a piece at Brexit, do write pieces about the political situation globally at the moment and have something to say. But I think it's amazing that you're doing the same. So it's just an observation.
Simon, you've got the mic.
Oh, well,
Are you going to be the roving?
I was just going to pass it around, but I do have a question if I should kick it off maybe.
It might not be turned on, sorry.
There's a button. It's going to be green.
Just preserving the batteries so we turned it off.
Oh, okay. Is it just that one? Oh, yeah. Okay. Cool. Hello. Going back to the capitalism thing, and tying that into process rather than artifact, it feels to me like a lot of what has happened in the last 40, 50 years in music, particularly in music technology, is that process has been consumerized. And Adrian, you were talking about having the luxury of a full-time job. It'd be interesting to have some statistics on the fact that, education's become so consumerized, but it also is the place that affords probably the majority of composition practice that no longer makes any money, even if it did at all. But I mean, and that's now happening in popular music more and more as well, that people are doing it as a kind of expensive hobby that is incredibly rewarding, can be very activist, can be, but it's been consumerized. And it feels like there's a kind of a subtle influence on, in some instances not so subtle, in that you're using a very kind of structured commercial product in the Spitfire samples thing. That's become it's like, it's not just an instrument, it's a very specific product. And this kind of social media thing, I mean, obviously, the famous statement, if you're not paying for it, then you're the product, I was thinking of an example for yours, and it's gone out of my head now, but basically this idea that, I know what it was. It was about categories and sort of essentializing, and the fact that whole thing seems to have come out of capitalism. Certainly all the titles of genres are all based on selling stuff, not on people's identities as such. And that way of putting people in boxes seems to be a product of that larger process, even if it's a more subtle version of it. So I wondered, just thinking about that, about the consumerization of process, whether you had any thoughts on that as a thing.
I mean, I can start. It's a big and loaded question. I think there's lots of thoughts about it. I think there's a huge thing about no. Like, it's a good loaded question because it's a real issue, right? And it's also a huge thing about privilege, and it's a huge thing about access and whether you even have the privilege of time to do the thing you want to do when you have to, work to have money to eat and pay rent. So who gets to actually be self-indulgent and do process when that doesn't sell? That's a real issue. And there's also always, I think, this interaction with so capitalism that is like, well, the agency between, oh, if it then sells, is that, good creatively? Is this what I want to do? Am I starting to cater towards that? Do people start seeing their value in how much they can make from the art? That's a really tricky one. I think there's a huge thing in popular music also about selling out. It's really hard because you can't win. I think that's capitalism in a nutshell, isn't it? You can't win.
Except that, there are all the good things as well.
Absolutely.
The democratization thing is real, even though
Massively
it's not
is.
as real as a lot of the books about it would have. But it still has made a huge difference to access. You don't
Massively.
have to be exceedingly rich to be able to do the stuff that
Massively, but you might also then have to cater towards what you think sells. So
or
sometimes
have it as a hobby.
or have it. Yeah, hobbies is a difficult one. I think also
hobby is a horrible word for
yeah,
it, but you know what I mean.
I totally hear you, and that's also, I think, hobby becomes the sort of thing that people use as a statement. It's like, oh, so you're not making money from it, so it's not valuable. Okay, so you're not good actually, so it's a hobby. So yeah, there's so much tricky stuff. I think it's just about, for me at least, it's a lot about value and saying that, the value might not come from the capitalist notion, but that's a very privileged thing to say. I also have a day job. I also work in production and events and lots of other things, which are also creatively interesting, but also not always the songwriter. It's not always the same. Luxury of time is hard. I find it really hard to find time. And then, that is me having still means to do that and a community that supports it. And lots of other little identity snippets that come and help me in my sense of privilege. It's hard.
It is pseudo-democratization. That's what we've got to say. We've got to always say that, because even with the Spitfire stuff, then they have all their free lab stuff, and then they give the version of the orchestra to the schools for basically free, and then there's a £49 one. But you still got to have a Mac or an iPad. It's pseudo-democratization, isn't it? But I suppose at least it's slightly better than what it was before. And then the other thing about the value of it and hobby, it's really interesting. But if we go back to process, this is where I think you're spot on. Actually, the value of this is the process. So I ride a bike, yeah. Well, really fat, so I'm really quick downhill. But the point is, right, I enjoy riding my bike. That's the thing. And I'm not going to be in the Tour de France. But I enjoy that process of going out and doing that. And there's some end results, yeah. I'm marginally less likely to have, a heart attack or something, maybe. But that's not the point of doing it. The point of doing it is I enjoy that process. Now, for me, it's the same as writing music and engaging with sound. I enjoy that process. And, you mentioned Csikszentmihalyi High. That's the point. I'm in my flow state. It's 4 a.m. before I know it. And that's the point of doing that. Now, that's the value in this. And I know there's an issue around productization and capitalism and all of that sort of stuff. But I'm thinking on my feet here, because actually the value to me then, the antidote to the capitalist kind of agenda around the productization of what we value, is just to enjoy the process and to value that, and
Funding
maybe
for the
that's a bit
arts.
naive there. I don't know. Say again. sorry.
Funding for the arts would also be good.
That's,
You know?
yeah, but that's why that's why we have to kind of fight for that.
Yeah.
But
You know-
also, funding for the arts is not a democratising process.
No, it's not. And I hear you on that. It's just like, I think on a sort of idealistic idea that, you know, to some extent, maybe it doesn't have to be sold all the time. Maybe, you know, some of these things can be supported in a way that also they can be community-based, that they can pull in practices, knowledges, experiences of people that normally are excluded. And maybe that could just be something to explore and be playful with, and that needs resources, and sharing resources and distributing that is hard the way that we've been doing it for the past.
I didn't even raise my hand. I just sort of went, I have a question. Is it okay? Does anyone mind?
We've got another one, so
Right. Hi. Oh, that's loud. I have a question about expertise, because I think there's a theme that I sort of pick up on in all three presentations. When we're doing practice research from the perspective of people with art practices before, we often get a kind of narrative on us about how we have to do that research from a place of practice knowledge, right? And that's kind of an implication that we have all this expertise, and if only we could get it out in writing and everyone would know what it was, right? But so coming to practice research from that position of expertise, it really strikes me that in each your own way, there's a pressure to kind of draw on a certain kind of expertise, but also to kind of reject a certain kind of sense that, yes, you do have expertise in this area, and that's what you should be drawing on. I really got that in the initial comments you were making, but for all. So could you comment on how you feel that in this practice research you want to relate to your own fields of expertise, and how that might be possibly a constraint or a motivating factor in the work?
Yes, I need a few seconds to think. Well, regarding the expertise, I think practice make perfection. So, and according to my work, the expertise not only include my compositional techniques, and actually techniques are important, yes, of course, but it's not that important to me. And also, in my process, respect the expertise and learn from the skills from my collaborative performers are also important. Yes, and I hope that answers your question.
Shall I? Thanks. I'm really uncomfortable with the idea of being an expert in something. It's weird, isn't it? Just imposter syndrome, but then maybe that's a good thing as well, having a bit of imposter syndrome. Just feel like a complete imposter every single day, though. A healthy dose of imposter syndrome is good, but then maybe too much isn't. The one time I don't feel insecure is when I'm kind of working with a score or out working on sound, and But I think actually, going back to what we were just talking about before in terms of what the point of this is, maybe. I wonder how much, as a composer or as composers, as creatives, how actually our expertise it's working with sound, but it's actually in the values that are behind that. So it's being an expert in empathy, being an expert in kindness, being an expert in pro-social issues. That's what's really important, and that's what sort of tries. That's where we're not rejecting expertise. I think we're probably trying to grow in those areas, and at the same time inform the practice that maybe feeds the values that we're trying to communicate and talk to.
I love that. I think expertise is an interesting one, because it's sort of like getting into a room and sort of almost justify your own experience. I mean, like, I know what I'm talking about because I'm doing the thing. But, at the same time, I think it's some of the most interesting things are when you're not an expert. Some of the most interesting things I've done are in things that I have no idea how to do. The first time you do something is amazing. I think we have such a fear of not being an expert. We have such a fear of walking into something and being like, I'm a novice. I actually don't know how the software works. Do I press this button? I think those spaces are really interesting. I think, yeah, like maybe it's a reframing of expertise. Maybe expertise is the attention we pay. So I think practice research is massively about paying attention and about articulation, because what differentiates practice from practice research, right? You know, there's a sense of attention, there's a sense of reflection, right? So I, in my own work, really like sort of exposing that I'm actually not an expert in the way that we might think about experts. The stuff I put out is not the stuff like typically regarded as the best or most accomplished, technically difficult songwriting you've ever seen. It's songwriting. It might be something that you do and can do. I believe everyone can do, by the way. So I think, yeah, like not being an expert in the way that we're often taught to understand that word, I think is a really generative space and really healing. It's okay not to be that, I think. And it's a really interesting spot. It's like, try something new, why not? People have all kinds of ideas about validity in spaces. Ageism massively as well comes into it, where people's like, oh, you know, older people can do that, or like that technology is for the people who've done it already. And I don't have 10 years of working with this, so I don't know. So find out. Why not? That experience is valid. And that experience can also be so generative, I think, to come at it with your own lived experience and embodied knowledge.
Thank you.
All right. We are at 10:58. I don't know if we've got time for many more questions. What do you think, Simon?
I think you're right. I think we probably should have discussions with a cup of coffee in hand.
Yeah. I think you
so-
guys will be happy to chat more.
Yeah, of course.
Sure.
Off camera, yeah. All right. Well, so thank you so much. Thank you so much, the three of you. Brilliant insights today.
Thank you. And thank you. You've been great.